Case 01. Shanda Vander Ark. In July 2022, police arrived at a quiet suburban home in Norton Shores, Michigan, on what had been logged as a routine welfare check. What they found when they entered that house was not routine. On the floor lay 15-year-old Timothy Ferguson, disabled, frail, and already dead. He weighed 69 pounds. The medical examiner's ruling was specific: starvation and hypothermia. The words the prosecution chose to describe what Timothy had endured in the months before his death were also specific: a campaign of torture. Those words were not chosen for their rhetorical impact. They were chosen because they were accurate, and because the evidence the prosecution laid before the Muskegon County jury made any softer description impossible to sustain. Timothy Ferguson was the son of Shanda Vander Ark. He was disabled, dependent, and entirely reliant on his mother for the food, warmth, and care that every child is legally and morally entitled to receive. What he received instead was a systematic program of deprivation that his mother designed, maintained, and escalated over time. The refrigerators and cabinets in the home were kept locked. Timothy could not access food without permission that was deliberately and consistently withheld. His sleep was disrupted. The punishments imposed on him were inventive in their cruelty. Ice baths that left him shivering and unable to regulate his body temperature. Spoonfuls of one of the world's hottest commercially available hot sauces forced into his mouth. He was made to sleep in a closet beneath the stairs, sometimes on nothing more than a tarp on the floor. The most disturbing evidence presented at trial did not come from medical experts or forensic analysis. It came from Vander Ark's own family. Her older son, Paul Ferguson, had participated in the abuse. Text messages between mother and son, recovered and entered into evidence, showed the two discussing punishment methods, including, in one exchange, whether to apply hot sauce to Timothy's genitals. This was not a household in crisis. This was a household in which the deliberate infliction of suffering on a disabled child had become a routine, discussed in text messages as casually as any other domestic matter. A video recovered during the investigation was so disturbing that the jury was shown only a portion of it. In the footage, Timothy's emaciated body is dragged by his arms across the floor. His bones are visible through his skin. He is wearing only a diaper. He is 15 years old. The defense attempted to argue that Vander Ark was overwhelmed, and that she had misinterpreted Timothy's refusal to eat as a deliberate hunger strike. The jury deliberated for less than 90 minutes. They convicted her on all counts: first-degree murder, and first-degree child abuse. At sentencing in January 2024, Judge Matthew Cassell went beyond the guidelines. He described her crimes as intentional, systematic torture, and sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 50 to 100 years. Timothy's brother Nolan addressed the court during the victim impact phase. He told the judge, "If I can't have my brother back, she shouldn't have her freedom back." Paul Ferguson, Vander Ark's older son, pleaded guilty to first-degree child abuse and received 30 to 100 years. In 2025, Vander Ark's request for a new trial was denied. Her life without parole sentence stands. Timothy Ferguson was 15 years old. He was disabled. He was dependent on his mother for everything. He received, instead of care, a program of suffering so sustained and so deliberate that the court could only describe it with one word: torture. Welcome to Daily Crime Archive. Every case we document is drawn from verified court records, forensic reports, and accredited news sources. No speculation, no exaggeration. Just the documented record of cases that challenged the courts, shook communities, and demanded answers that the justice system was forced to provide. If that is the kind of content you want more of, subscribe before we begin. It takes 2 seconds, and it keeps this archive going. Now, let's continue. Case 02, Rakonda Singleton. In the early hours of January 25, 2025, a fire ripped through a house on Eastern Avenue in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Inside were 3 sisters: 12-year-old Shamia Stewart, her 10-year-old sibling, and her 7-year-old sibling. All 3 were asleep. The blaze would kill Shamia and leave her sisters with severe injuries. The fire was not an accident. It had been set by their mother. Before Rakonda Singleton poured lighter fluid in the upstairs bathroom and ignited the living room couch, she had moved through the house and removed 7 smoke detectors. She stuffed them into a pillowcase and placed it outside. She timed the ignition for the early morning hours, when she calculated her children would most likely be deeply asleep. When first responders arrived, Singleton was outside the house. The screams of her children came from within. Firefighters entered the burning structure and pulled the girls out. Shamia could not be saved. She died 2 days later in the hospital. Her younger sisters survived, but both sustained significant injuries that will require long-term recovery. In interviews with detectives, Singleton initially denied responsibility. Then she confessed. She told investigators, "I am not going to sit here and play like I am the victim." She described believing that death had come over her, that she intended to die alongside her 3 daughters so that they could all, in her words, be free. She described severe mental health symptoms in the months preceding the fire, including paranoia, hallucinations, and delusional thinking. The legal proceedings that followed reflected the specific complexity of the case. Singleton was arrested and charged with arson, 3 counts of child abuse, and felony murder following Shamia's death. In February 2025, a judge ordered a competency evaluation. By mid-year, she had been found incompetent to stand trial and placed into psychiatric treatment, with the court scheduled to review her case at regular intervals to determine whether competency could be restored. Court documents surfaced troubling background details. Child Protective Services had received concerns about the household months before the fire. Singleton had been involuntarily hospitalized in 2024, but her case was closed when it was assessed that her children were safe. That assessment, in retrospect, drew sharp and sustained criticism from child welfare advocates, investigators, and the community. The prosecution entered a not guilty plea on Singleton's behalf and made clear they intended to pursue the charges aggressively, arguing that the removal of smoke detectors, the deliberate application of an accelerant, and the calculated timing of the ignition constituted premeditation sufficient to satisfy the intent elements of first-degree arson and felony murder, regardless of her mental state. The legal question the case poses is one that courts have confronted before and have never resolved cleanly. When does the documented collapse of a person's mental reality intersect with criminal accountability for acts that bear the formal markers of deliberate planning? Shamia was 12 years old. She was asleep. The smoke detectors that might have woken her had been removed by her mother and placed in a pillowcase outside the front door. Case 03, Mitchelle Blair. In the spring of 2015, bailiffs in Detroit, carrying out a routine eviction at an apartment complex, opened a chest freezer and found the body of 13-year-old Stoney Blair. Alongside her was the body of her 9-year-old brother, Stephen Barry. Both had been dead for months, possibly longer. Their bodies had been stored in the freezer in their own home. They had been there the entire time that the rest of the family, including their mother, Mitchelle Blair, and their surviving siblings, had been living in the apartment above them. Stoney and Stephen were 2 of Blair's 4 children. The 2 surviving children had been living in the same home. They had been going to school. Neighbors had seen them. Child Protective Services had visited the address on multiple occasions in prior years, prompted by referrals citing malnourishment, burns, bruises, and signs of chronic neglect. The children were homeschooled, which reduced the number of external adults with regular access to them. The concerns that had been logged and referred had not, in the end, produced an intervention that stopped what was happening inside that apartment. Blair pleaded guilty in Wayne County Circuit Court to 2 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of Stoney and Stephen. She admitted to killing Stoney deliberately. Regarding Stephen, she described his death as accidental, but did not contest her responsibility for concealing his body and for allowing the conditions that led to his death. She offered an allegation, which prosecutors contested, and for which no corroborating forensic evidence was found, that both children had sexually abused a younger sibling. The surviving children testified during subsequent legal proceedings. One son described physical abuse and chronic neglect. Photographs admitted into evidence documented the conditions inside the apartment: inadequate bedding, filthy living conditions, and the freezer. The freezer in which the bodies of his siblings had been stored for months, running and in use, while the family lived around it. At one hearing, when confronted with the potential loss of custody of her surviving children, Blair made an outburst from the gallery. "Yes, I did kill her." The statement was captured in the court record. Sentencing took place in July 2015. Judge Dana Hathaway imposed life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge described Blair's actions as going beyond neglect, as calculated cruelty, sustained concealment, and a fundamental betrayal of every obligation a parent carries. 2 separate CPS referrals over prior years had documented concern about the children in that household. Neither referral had produced an outcome that protected Stoney or Stephen. The systemic question that the Blair case places permanently on the record, why the documented concerns did not produce intervention in time, has not been answered by the sentence. 3 cases into tonight's archive. 5 more to come. If you are watching and have not subscribed yet, do it now. It takes 2 seconds, and it directly supports everything Daily Crime Archive is building. Back to the record. Case 04, Azerati, France. In June 2022, Detroit police responded to a welfare check at a home on the city's west side. In the basement, inside a chest freezer wrapped in plastic, was the body of 3-year-old Chase Allen. The medical examiner determined he had died from blunt force trauma to the head. The investigation established that he had suffered severe abuse in the days before his death. His mother, Azerati, France, admitted to investigators that she had kicked him in the chest when he refused food. When she found him unresponsive the following morning, she placed his body in a bag, put it in the freezer, and said nothing. Weeks passed before investigators uncovered what had happened. France was charged with felony murder, torture, first-degree child abuse, and concealing a death. The investigation into her background produced a history that is documented, frustrating, and familiar in the context of cases like this one. Child Protective Services had opened investigations into France on multiple occasions between 2017 and 2020. Allegations included neglect, improper supervision, and physical abuse. In at least some of those cases, children were removed from the home and later returned. Chase Allen was 3 years old when France kicked him in the chest and then placed his body in a freezer. By July 2024, France accepted a plea agreement. She pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. The remaining charges were dismissed. Judge Tracy Green sentenced her to 35 to 60 years in prison, describing the case as one of the most heartbreaking to come before her court. Because the case resolved through a plea rather than a trial, the full evidentiary record was never presented in open court. What the record does show, through the autopsy report, the CPS history, and France's own admissions, is a 3-year-old boy who had been seen by a child welfare system on multiple occasions, who had been returned to a home where he was at documented risk, and who died alone in a basement freezer weeks before anyone came looking for him. Case 05, Tatiana Fusari. In August 2018, authorities in Kent County, Michigan, were called to a home in Salem Township. Inside, they found the body of 10-month-old Mary Welch. She weighed approximately 8 pounds, barely more than her birth weight. The medical examiner determined she had died from malnutrition and dehydration. Her parents, Seth Welch and Tatiana Fusari, told investigators they had watched their daughter grow progressively weaker over a period of weeks and had not sought medical help. Their stated reason was a combination of religious conviction and fear. They distrusted doctors on ideological grounds. They believed that if they brought Mary to a physician, Child Protective Services would be alerted, and their children would be removed from the home. So they did nothing, day after day, as Mary lost weight she could not afford to lose, as her body began the specific and documentable process of organ failure that prolonged starvation produces. They watched, and did not call for help. When deputies arrived and described Mary's condition, the details were precise and clinical in the way that forensic reports always are, and that somehow only deepens the horror. Eyes and cheeks sunken, bones visible beneath the skin, the cold and frail stillness of a body that had been failing for a long time. Medical experts testified at trial that she had been deprived of adequate nutrition and hydration for weeks, possibly months. Her thymus gland had shrunk. Her bone marrow had weakened. Her organs had shut down one by one. Neighbors and family members had expressed concern about Mary's health before her death. Those concerns had not produced any intervention in time. Fusari's defense presented her as a woman living under Welch's control, emotionally abused, physically intimidated, and effectively powerless to act against his directives. The court found that whatever the dynamics of the relationship, Fusari had been present, had been aware that Mary was deteriorating, and had made the choice not to seek help. She was convicted of first-degree murder and first-degree child abuse. She was sentenced to life in prison without parole, plus an additional 15 to 30 years for the child abuse conviction. Seth Welch was convicted on the same charges and received the same sentence. This case does not involve violence in the conventional sense. There were no physical blows, no fire, no weapon. The horror of Mary Welch's death is in its slowness, in the daily repetition of a decision not to act, maintained across weeks, while a 10-month-old baby's body consumed itself for lack of the most basic care. She weighed 8 pounds when she died. She had been alive for 10 months. Case 06. Amanda Mason. In February 2018, emergency responders were called to a home in Port Huron Township, Michigan, where 3-year-old Matthew Mason had died. The circumstances were initially suspicious. The investigation that followed would take 7 years to produce criminal charges. In April 2025, Matthew's mother, Amanda Mason, 33, and her then-boyfriend, Maurice Hovell, 28, were arraigned in St. Clair County District Court on charges of first-degree murder. Both entered not guilty pleas. A judge denied bond, citing the weight of the evidence. The court documents that accompanied the arraignment described a pattern of abuse that prosecutors alleged had extended across the full span of Matthew's short life. According to those documents, Amanda and Hovell repeatedly slammed Matthew's head against drywall with enough force to leave visible dents in the walls. He was forced into stress positions, made to kneel for extended periods as punishment. He was locked in a room for hours at a time, deprived of food and water. Witnesses described incidents of smothering with a pillow, sometimes framed as play, sometimes as punishment, always by the people responsible for his safety. One of the most disturbing allegations in the charging documents involves motive. Prosecutors contend that Amanda Mason and Maurice Hovell made a deliberate decision that Matthew had to be eliminated, not in the language of impulse or rage, but as a calculated determination, in order to make room for another child. A 3-year-old boy's life, treated as a logistical obstacle. The forensic path to these charges was long. An autopsy report released in 2021, following years of forensic review, concluded that Matthew's death was a homicide. The medical examiner cited blunt force trauma and possible mechanical asphyxiation, with injuries consistent with the abuse pattern prosecutors described. Between that 2021 finding and the April 2025 arraignment, investigators conducted additional witness interviews, gathered further documentation, and compiled the body of evidence they determined was sufficient to sustain first-degree murder charges. Child Protective Services had been in contact with the family. Amanda Mason is accused of canceling medical appointments to prevent physicians from examining Matthew's injuries and of providing CPS with misleading accounts of how he had been hurt. The oversight that might have stopped the abuse was, according to prosecutors, actively obstructed by the person responsible for it. As of the date of this documentary, the case is proceeding through the Michigan court system. A preliminary examination, a proceeding in which prosecutors must demonstrate sufficient evidence to bind the defendants over for a full trial, is scheduled. The case has not yet reached a verdict. Matthew Mason was 3 years old. He died in 2018. The people charged with his murder were arraigned in 2025. 7 years passed between his death and the day the charges were formally read aloud in a courtroom. 6 cases documented, 2 more in tonight's archive. If you have been watching since the beginning and have not subscribed yet, now is the moment. Every subscription directly supports this channel. Back to the record. On an April afternoon in 2024, the Swan Boat Club in Berlin Township, Monroe County, Michigan, was hosting a children's birthday party. The pavilion was decorated. Balloons moved in the spring air. Families had gathered by the waterfront, the kind of ordinary Saturday afternoon that communities are built on, that parents take photographs of, that children remember. Among the children present were 8-year-old Alana Phillips and her 4-year-old brother Zayn. Their father, Brian Phillips, had been there earlier in the day and had left shortly before the crash. He later described the specific dread that hit him in the car, the particular, inexplicable knowledge that something had gone wrong, as an experience he cannot fully articulate. At that same moment, 67-year-old Marcela Chistister was behind the wheel of an SUV. Toxicology tests conducted after the crash confirmed her blood alcohol level at 0.18, more than double Michigan's legal limit. Surveillance footage recovered from the area showed her vehicle traveling at 44 miles per hour before it left the road. The SUV plowed through the entrance of the pavilion and continued nearly 25 feet into the structure, through tables and chairs and the families seated at them. Alana and Zayn Phillips were killed instantly. 15 other people, children and adults, were injured. Some sustained broken bones. Some suffered traumatic brain injuries. Some will carry permanent physical limitations. Survivors describe the moment of impact as something that did not register as a real event until it was already over. A sound, then silence, then chaos. When police arrived at the scene, Chistister was present. Officers documented that she smelled strongly of alcohol, that her eyes were bloodshot and her speech slurred, and that she had difficulty standing without support. A blood draw conducted hours after the crash confirmed her intoxication level. Investigators also recovered bar receipts and empty wine bottles from her home and vehicle consistent with heavy consumption earlier that day. Prosecutors charged her with second-degree murder, 2 counts of operating while intoxicated causing death, and multiple counts of operating while intoxicated causing serious injury. Over the course of the trial, 27 witnesses testified: crash survivors, medical experts, toxicologists, and law enforcement officers who had administered sobriety evaluations at the scene. The state argued that a person with a blood alcohol level of 0.18, who chose to drive a vehicle, had made a decision whose foreseeable consequences included exactly what occurred. The defense raised 2 specific challenges: a medical condition, peripheral neuropathy affecting her legs and feet, that they argued may have caused her to press the accelerator instead of the brake, and a challenge to the integrity of the blood samples, suggesting that improper mixing of preservatives could have artificially elevated the reading. The jury weighed those arguments against the surveillance footage, the witness testimony, and the physical destruction of the pavilion, and returned a verdict in 2 hours. On March 6, 2025, Chistister was convicted on all counts. At the sentencing hearing on May 15, 2025, Alana and Zayn's mother, Mariah Dodds, addressed the court. She said her world had ended on that April afternoon. She described the laughter her children had, the specific way each of them moved through a room, and the silence that had replaced those things. Their father, Zayn Phillips, described the moment he understood what had happened, the moment the intuition he had felt in the car was confirmed. A young survivor, still carrying both physical and emotional injuries from the crash, told the court directly, "She ruined my life. I want her to pay." Judge Daniel White sentenced Chistister to 25 to 50 years in prison. Because of her age, 67 at sentencing, it is considered virtually certain she will spend the remainder of her life incarcerated. She offered an apology to the court. She said she never meant to harm the children or anyone present. For the families of Alana and Zayn Phillips, those words occupied the same space as the silence where their children used to be. Case 08. Jennifer Crumbley. On November 30, 2021, 15-year-old Ethan Crumbley walked into Oxford High School in Oxford Township, Michigan, and opened fire with a handgun in the school cafeteria. 4 students were killed: Hannah Street Juliana, 14, Tate Meyer, 16, Madison Baldwin, 17, and Justin Schilling, 17. 7 others were wounded. The shooting was the deadliest in Michigan's history. What made the Oxford High School case different from the long, terrible history of American school shootings was what happened in the courtroom in the 2 years that followed. Because prosecutors did not only charge Ethan Crumbley, they charged his parents. Jennifer Crumbley and her husband James Crumbley were charged with 4 counts each of involuntary manslaughter, 1 count for each of the 4 students their son killed. The prosecution's theory was precise: that both parents had received explicit, documented warning of their son's deteriorating mental state and his specific intent to cause violence, and that both parents had chosen not to act, and that the deaths that followed were the direct and documentable consequence of that choice. The documented record that prosecutors presented at Jennifer Crumbley's trial in February 2024 was substantial. In the weeks before the shooting, Ethan had produced drawings that depicted violence, a person being shot, a bullet, and phrases including "the thoughts won't stop" and "help me." Those drawings had been found by a teacher and reported. On the morning of November 30th, the morning of the shooting, school officials called Jennifer and James Crumbley into the building for an emergency meeting about their son's behavior. The meeting lasted approximately 20 minutes. Both parents were shown the drawings. Both were told their son needed mental health support and that it needed to be arranged that day. Both parents left the school. They left Ethan there. The handgun Ethan Crumbley used in the shooting had been purchased 4 days earlier by James Crumbley. It had been presented to Ethan as an early Christmas gift. Jennifer Crumbley had taken her son to a shooting range to practice with it the day after the purchase. The weapon was not secured. It was accessible in the family home. On the morning of the shooting, Ethan had carried it into the school in his backpack. Jennifer Crumbley's defense team argued that she could not have predicted her son's actions, that she had not known he was capable of this level of violence, that she was not the one who purchased the gun, and that her choices, however imperfect, did not rise to the level of criminal negligence. The prosecution countered with the specific weight of what she had been told that morning, that her son had written drawings depicting a person being shot, had written the words, "Help me," alongside those drawings, and that school officials believed he required immediate intervention. She had been told all of this. She had left him at the school. Hours later, 4 students were dead. On February 6, 2024, the jury found Jennifer Crumbley guilty on all 4 counts of involuntary manslaughter. James Crumbley was convicted on the same charges the following month. Both were sentenced to 10 to 15 years in prison. The verdict made history. Jennifer Crumbley became the first parent in the United States to be criminally convicted for a school shooting carried out by her child. The precedent the case establishes, that a parent's documented failure to respond to documented warning signs can constitute criminal negligence when it contributes to the deaths of others, has been discussed in legal, educational, and child welfare contexts across the country in the 2 years since the verdict. The families of Hannah Street Juliana, Tate Meyer, Madison Baldwin, and Justin Schilling delivered victim impact statements at the sentencing hearing. They described the specific weight of each loss, the particular future that had been taken, the specific silence left behind. The judge told Jennifer Crumbley from the bench that this was not a case about imperfect parenting. The case was about a specific set of warnings, a specific set of choices, and 4 students who did not go home from school on November 30, 2021 because of both. That is tonight's archive. 8 cases, every detail sourced from verified court records, forensic reports, and accredited documentation. If this kind of content, documented, thorough, and without filler, is what you want more of, subscribing to Daily Crime Archive is the most direct way to support it. We will see you in the next one.